The noise inside a middle school cafeteria during a lockdown drill is nothing like the silence that follows a real one. Sloane Darby had learned that difference the hard way, in a place so far from Millhaven, Virginia, that most people couldn't find it on a map without help. But that was before. Before the badge clipped to her, lanyard said, "Disciplined teacher" instead of anything classified. Before she wore cardigans with fraying cuffs and carried a tote bag full of dry erase markers. Before the other teachers at Millhaven Middle School learned to look through her the way you look through a window when you're not interested in the view. She had been there 3 months when Principal Rutledge first forgot her name in a meeting. Not an honest slip, the kind where you catch yourself and apologize. The deliberate kind where you keep talking and let the silence confirm that the person doesn't matter enough to correct. "Miss, the sub covering Harrington's class," Rutledge had said, not looking up from his clipboard. "Can you take afternoon hall duty again this week?" Sloane said yes. She always said yes. She ate lunch alone in room 214, which was technically a storage closet that someone had wedged a folding table into. The other teachers had a lounge with a Keurig machine and a refrigerator covered in birthday cards. She'd been invited exactly once, in her first week, and she'd shown up to find the conversation stop and restart at a different temperature. After that, she stopped trying. The kids called her Miss Darby or Miss Nobody, depending on the day and who was watching. She had one student, a 7th grader named Caleb Fontaine, who actually paid attention in class and occasionally left a sticky note on her desk that said things like "good lesson today," or "you explained fractions better than Mr. Harrington ever did." She kept them in her tote bag. She wasn't sure why. The teachers who noticed Sloane at all had decided certain things about her, that she was shy, that she probably hadn't gone to a good school, that she dressed like someone who had given up on impressing anyone. Miss Prescott, who taught 7th grade English and wore her opinions like jewelry, had once said within earshot that whoever hired Sloane must have been desperate. She didn't lower her voice when she said it. Sloane had been in the copy room. She had looked up from the paper jam she was clearing and made eye contact with Prescott through the glass partition, and Prescott had held her gaze for exactly 1 second before turning away, laughing at something someone else said. That night, Sloane had sat in her rental apartment eating soup from a can and stared at the wall for a long time. Not because it hurt the way it might have once, more because she recognized the particular shape of it. The way certain people decided who you were before you opened your mouth and then organized everything you did afterward to confirm what they'd already concluded. She'd met that shape in other rooms, smaller rooms with no windows. She'd learned to let it move through her like weather. The morning of December 9th started the same way most mornings did. Sloane arrived at 7:14, signed in at the front desk, and made her way to room 114, 8th grade history, covering for Mr. Harrington, who had been on medical leave since October. She wrote the agenda on the whiteboard in her small, even handwriting. She set out the worksheets. She poured coffee from the thermos she brought from home because the lounge Keurig required a code she'd never been given. At 7:52, the first bell rang. At 8:03, Assistant Principal Darnell Vick appeared in her doorway. He was a compact man with a tight jaw and the particular energy of someone who had once played college football and never stopped being annoyed that no one brought it up anymore. He looked at Sloane the way he always did, like she was a piece of furniture that had been placed somewhere slightly inconvenient. "I need your room for a parent meeting at 9, he said. "Move your class to the gym." "No question. No, please. I have 23 8th graders during second period," Sloane said. "The gym has a partition," Vic said. "Coach Tillman's class can share." He was already walking away when he said it. Sloane looked at the worksheets laid out on every desk. She looked at the whiteboard. She picked up her coffee, took one quiet sip, and began erasing the agenda. By 8:55, she had relocated 23 students to the east half of the gymnasium and negotiated a grudging truce with Coach Tillman, who made no effort to hide that he considered the arrangement an imposition. The students were restless. The gym smelled like rubber and old socks. Someone had left a basketball directly in the path between the partition and the bleachers, and Sloane moved it without thinking, a small automatic calculation about trip hazards that her brain made before the rest of her caught up. Old habit. She was in the middle of explaining the causes of the Civil War when she heard the first sound from the hallway. Most people wouldn't have registered it as anything. A bump. Possibly a cart. Possibly someone dropping a load of textbooks. The kind of ambient noise that school buildings make all day long and everyone learns to ignore. Sloane stopped talking. Not dramatically. She didn't freeze or spin around. She just paused in the middle of a sentence about Fort Sumter and listened. Caleb Fontaine looked up from his notebook. He was the only one who noticed she'd stopped. The second sound came 11 seconds later. Sloane counted. A heavier impact, lower in pitch. A door, not a cart. And behind it, barely audible, a voice raised not in conversation but in something else. She set her marker on the whiteboard ledge. "Everyone move to the back wall," she said. Her voice was the same register it had been when she was explaining Reconstruction. Calm. Even. Not a request. Half the class kept talking. "Now," she said, still calm. Something in the word, though, some frequency underneath it, made all 23 students stand up. Coach Tillman's head appeared around the partition. "What's going? Get your class to the back wall," Sloane said. "Lock your phone and call 911. Tell them you need a code red at Millhaven Middle, multiple subjects, hallway B wing, don't open any doors." Tillman stared at her. "Do it now, coach." He did. Sloane moved to the gymnasium door. Not the main entrance, but the auxiliary exit on the east side, the one that opened onto the service corridor, running along the back of the building. She knew it was there because she had spent her first week walking every inch of this school the way she'd been trained to walk every building she'd ever entered. Exits, choke points, sight lines, the location of the fire extinguishers, the breaker panel, the one hallway that doubled back on itself and became a dead end if you didn't know the floor plan. She'd done it quietly. Nobody had noticed. She cracked the auxiliary door 2 inches and listened. The service corridor was clear. She could hear the main hallway through the wall, the particular quality of sound that came from a space where people were trying not to make noise and failing. 2 voices. Maybe 3. A hard, clipped cadence that had nothing to do with teachers or students. She let the door close silently. She turned back to 47 children sitting against the back wall of a gymnasium, staring at her with wide eyes and open mouths, and she said the truest thing she could. "Stay here. Stay low. Stay quiet. You're going to be fine." Then she was in the service corridor. She didn't have a weapon. She hadn't carried one in 14 months, since the day she handed in her credentials and signed the paperwork and walked out of a building in Northern Virginia into a parking lot where it was raining. And she had stood there for a while, not knowing what she was supposed to do with her hands. She didn't need one yet. What she had was a fire extinguisher, which she pulled from its bracket in the service corridor with her left hand. What she had was the floor plan of this building memorized to the point where she could close her eyes and walk it. What she had was the knowledge, hard-won and expensive in ways she didn't think about anymore, that the difference between a threat and a managed threat was usually information. She needed to know how many, where they were positioned, whether they were containing or searching. She got her answer sooner than expected. The door to the main B-wing hallway opened 20 feet ahead of her, and a man stepped through it. He was not a teacher. He was not a parent. He was dressed in dark clothing with his face partially covered, and he was moving with the particular focus of someone who had been given a specific task and was executing it. He hadn't seen her yet. He was checking his phone. Sloane was already moving. She closed the 20 feet in the time it took him to look up, and what happened next took approximately 4 seconds and was entirely silent. The fire extinguisher served a purpose somewhat different from its intended one. The man went down without making a sound that would carry through the door. She caught him before he hit the floor. She held his position for 3 seconds, listening. No response from the hallway. Good. They were spread out, not coordinated well enough. She took what he'd been carrying, a zip tie kit and a radio, and left the extinguisher. The radio crackled once. A voice she didn't recognize said, "East Wing clear." Moving to the main office, where the attendance records were, where the emergency contact database lived, where, Sloane knew, Principal Rutledge had been hosting a budget meeting since 8 o'clock that included 3 members of the school board. She moved. The next 4 minutes were not clean. Clean was something that happened in movies, where the right person always turned the right corner at the right moment, and no one's hands shook afterward. Real situations were ugly and loud in some places and too quiet in others, and you made decisions with partial information in fractions of a second and lived with what happened because there was no alternative. What Sloane knew, there were 3 of them total. She confirmed this from the radio traffic and from what she found in the main corridor. The one in the service corridor had been the perimeter. The second was covering the main entrance. She dealt with him near the trophy case outside the gym, where he'd made the mistake of turning his back to a shallow alcove because he hadn't done the same walkthrough she had on day 1. The third was already inside the main office. She could hear Rutledge's voice through the closed door, the specific tone of a man trying to sound calm and failing at the edges. She heard the school board members. She heard a woman, Ms. Gable, the front desk secretary, 63 years old and 22 years at this school, being told to sit down. Sloane stood outside the main office door for exactly 2 seconds. Then she knocked. Not a pound, a knock. 3 beats, measured like she was delivering attendance folders. There was a silence on the other side. "Maintenance," she said. Same flat voice she used when she was telling students to take their seats. "There's a gas line issue in B wing. I need the principal to come out and sign off." Another silence. She counted. The door opened 3 inches, which was all she needed. What happened in the next 30 seconds was something she would decline to describe in detail later when people asked. The relevant facts were, the third man did not succeed at what he'd come to do. Ms. Gable sustained a minor cut on her hand from a piece of broken desk organizer, and Principal Rutledge pressed himself against the back wall so hard he left a mark on the whiteboard behind him. When the door was fully open again, and Sloane was standing in the threshold, she looked at Rutledge. He was staring at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. It took her a moment to identify it. He didn't know who she was. Not the way he'd never learned her name. A different kind of not knowing, the specific, vertiginous feeling of realizing you have been looking at something for months without ever actually seeing it. "Ms. he started. "Darby," she said. "Sloane Darby. I've been covering Mr. Harrington's class since October." She pulled the radio from her jacket pocket and set it on the front desk. She could hear sirens now. Several of them close. "I'm going to go check on my students," she said. "The men in the B-Wing service corridor and the main entrance hallway are secured. Tell the police that when they come in, I don't want anyone getting confused about the situation." She turned and walked back down the hallway. The police came in fast and organized, the way they always did when someone had already done the hard part. Sloane met them at the gymnasium auxiliary exit with her hands visible and her ID badge held up. The one that said Astaplete Teacher in laminated text that was starting to peel at one corner and gave a clear, sequential account of what had happened and where. The detective who took her statement, a tall woman named Okafor with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, listened without interrupting, which Sloane appreciated. When she was done, Okafor looked at her for a long moment. "You said you're a substitute teacher," she said. "Yes." "How long have you been a substitute teacher?" "About 3 months, and before that." Sloane looked at the parking lot, where 3 news vans were already setting up and a crowd of parents was forming behind the police tape. She found Caleb Fontaine in the group of students being released to families, his mother holding him by both shoulders and crying into his hair. "I did some consulting work," she said, "for the government." Okafor wrote something in her notebook. Then she said, "We're going to need more than that eventually." "I know," Sloane said, "but not today." The story broke by noon. By 3 o'clock, it was on national news, framed the way these things always got framed. Heroic teacher stops armed intruders. The school district put out a statement. A spokesperson used the phrase quick thinking 4 times. Nobody used Sloane's name in the first cycle because nobody at the district office knew her name, which turned out to say something about how closely they paid attention to their own staff. Ms. Prescott was interviewed by a local news crew in the parking lot. She described the atmosphere as incredibly tense and said that all the teachers had been trained for situations like this, which was technically true if you counted the 15-minute video they'd watched in September. Sloane sat in room 114, her room, which apparently was her room again, now that the parent meeting had been indefinitely postponed, and ate the sandwich she'd packed that morning. The dry erase markers were still on the ledge. The worksheets about Fort Sumter were still on the desks, because nobody had come to class in the afternoon, and everything had just stayed where it was. She was still sitting there at 4:30 when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Not the normal after-school scatter of it. Something more deliberate, more than one person, moving in step. She knew that rhythm. She stood up. There were 4 of them in the doorway. They were in civilian clothes, dark jackets. Nothing that would read as uniform to someone who didn't know what to look for. But everything else about them was written in the way they stood and how they scanned the room when they entered it. The one in front was a woman, early 40s, with a jaw like a closed door and eyes that took in everything at once. Her name was Chief Warrant Officer Bridget Hale, though she wasn't going to introduce herself that way here. She had served with Sloane in 2 theaters and 1 operation that still didn't have a name in any document that anyone could legally access. She stopped in the doorway and looked at Sloane for a long moment, at the cardigan, at the tote bag, at the peeling laminate badge, and the dry erase markers and the Fort Sumter worksheets on the student desks. Then she did something that made the other 3 do it automatically, without discussion, the way a reflex works. She brought her right hand to her forehead. All 4 of them in room 114 of Millhaven Middle School at 4:30 in the afternoon stood at attention and saluted a substitute teacher who was holding half a turkey sandwich. Sloane lowered the sandwich. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, not quite something else. Whatever it was, she let it stay for just a moment before it settled into something quieter. She straightened her spine by about 1/4 of an inch. To anyone watching, it might not have been visible. To the 4 people in the doorway, it was as clear as a bell. She returned the salute. Bridget dropped her hand and crossed the room in 4 steps and did what she hadn't done in the 2 years since Sloane had walked away from all of it. She put both arms around her and held on. "You couldn't just retire quietly," Bridget said into her shoulder. "I was eating lunch," Sloane said. "You cleared 3 hostels in a public school with a fire extinguisher and a zip tie kit and a radio. Bridget pulled back and looked at her. Something in her expression was asking a question she didn't put into words. Sloane answered it anyway. "I'm okay," she said. "I'm actually okay." Bridget studied her face the way only someone who had been in bad places with you could. Looking for the specific fractures, knowing where they'd been before, checking if they'd held. She must have found what she was looking for, because she nodded once and let it go. The hallway outside room 114 had acquired an audience. Principal Rutledge was there. Darnell Vick was there, standing slightly behind him. Ms. Prescott had materialized from somewhere with 2 other teachers. Sloane recognized by face, but not name. They were all watching through the window in the classroom door with expressions that didn't quite know what to be, because what they were watching didn't fit anywhere in the file built for Sloane Darby. And files, once built, are very resistant to revision. Bridget's team had positioned themselves with their backs to the window. Not by design, just because that was where they stood when they stood anywhere. Between the person they were there to see and whatever was behind them, it was automatic. The way the fire extinguisher calculation had been automatic, the way Sloane had known about the auxiliary exit before she needed it. Some things don't leave. Rutledge pushed the door open. He held his clipboard the way he always did, like a shield, though tonight it looked less authoritative than usual. "Miss Darby," he said. Then he stopped, because the four people who turned to look at him were looking at him with a quality of attention that was not aggressive but was also unmistakably not the kind of attention he was accustomed to receiving. He tried again. "I wanted to. The district wants to formally." He looked at Bridget, then back at Sloane. "Are these colleagues of yours? Old friends?" Sloane said. Rutledge nodded slowly. He had the look of someone standing in a room where he'd just understood that the furniture had always been arranged differently than he'd thought. "I owe you an apology," he said. It came out smaller than he'd probably intended. Sloane looked at him. She let the silence be what it was. "I should have learned your name," he said, "a long time ago." In the doorway, Miss Prescott had gone very still. "Yes," Sloane said. "You should have." She didn't say anything after that, because there wasn't anything to add. Some things are completed by being stated plainly, and this was one of them. Rutledge nodded again. He looked at the floor for a moment, then he said, "The district would like to offer you a permanent position, full-time, benefits, if you want it." Sloane considered him. "I'll think about it," she said. She turned back to Bridget, who was watching all of this with an expression that was not quite a smirk, but was close enough to one that Sloane gave her a look that said don't. Bridget's expression returned to neutral. "Come on," Sloane said. "I know a diner that's still open." They sat in a corner booth at Ruby's on 5th Street, Sloane and Bridget and the three others, whose names she knew and whose faces she hadn't seen in over a year, and they ordered coffee and pie, because it was that kind of evening. The diner was half empty. A man at the counter was reading a newspaper that had the word Millhaven in the headline. The waitress, a teenager with a nose ring and ink-stained fingers, poured coffee without being asked and disappeared again. Bridget wrapped both hands around her mug. "We heard about it on the wire," she said, "about 45 minutes after it happened." "Efficient," Sloane said. "It's a small community." Bridget looked at her. "You know people have been asking about you, checking in." "I know. And you've been here 3 months substituting 8th grade history." Someone had to cover for Harrington. One of the others, a broad-shouldered man named Curtis, who had once carried Sloane 300 meters through a drainage ditch in conditions she didn't like to think about, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He was looking at the table when he did it, and his jaw was doing something complicated. "Hey," Sloane said. He looked up. "I'm okay," she said again. "I mean it." He nodded. He looked back at the table. His jaw did the thing again. They drank their coffee. Outside, the parking lot of Ruby's Diner was lit orange by the street lamps. And somewhere across town, there were still news vans parked outside Millhaven Middle School, and the cafeteria was still locked for evidence, and 47 children were home with their families being held a little tighter than usual. Sloane thought about Caleb Fontaine and his mother. She thought about the sticky note still in her tote bag that said, "Good lesson today." She thought about room 114, and the worksheets on the desks and the dry erase markers lined up on the ledge, and she realized, sitting in a diner booth with 4 people who knew everything she'd ever done and were still willing to drive 3 hours to stand in a middle school classroom and bring their hands to their foreheads. She realized that she hadn't made a mistake coming here. She had not been hiding. She had been choosing. There was a difference, and it had taken her this long to feel it clearly enough to trust it. Bridget ordered a second slice of pie. "You were always the quietest one in any room," she said. "I used to think it was a tactic." "It was at first," Sloane said. "And now?" Sloane looked out the window at the orange light on the parking lot asphalt. "Now it's just who I am," she said. And that turned out to be enough.